Hi guys, we will now discuss current assets. An asset shall be classified as current when it satisfies any of the following criteria. So take note that if any, kahit isa lang ang masasatisfy na condition, automatically it will be classified as a current asset. So there are 4 criteria in determining whether an asset is current. So what is the first criteria? It is expected to be realized in or is intended for sale or consumption in the entity's normal operating cycle. So I want to clarify a word that may confuse some of you. The word here is realized. Pag sinabi nating realized, in the context of current assets, what are we talking about? Realize means convert into cash. It is expected to be converted into cash. Marirealize natin siya into cash. That is what we mean by the word realize. Mako-convert natin siya sa cash in the entity's normal operating cycle. So because of this criteria, accounts receivable, supplies, and prepaid rent are classified as current assets. Why is accounts receivable a current asset? Because it is part of the entity's normal operating cycle. Kasama sa operations ang accounts receivable. It's because pag may mga customers tayo, may mga customers talaga who cannot pay in cash. May mga customers talaga that will not pay us in cash, but they will purchase through credit or they will purchase in credit. Kumbaga pa, uutang muna sila. Kasi wala silang available cash as of the moment. Uutang muna sila for 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, and then after that 3 months, that's the time they will pay. So it's natural. Kasama yan sa business or kasama yan sa common practice yan sa mga businesses. Kasi hindi lahat ng customers or hindi lahat ng mga customers have the cash to pay right away. May mga customers talaga na credit muna, uutang muna sila. And then kung may cash na sila, that's the time they will pay. That's why accounts receivable is a current asset. Next is supplies. Pag sinabi nating supplies, bond paper, ball pen, spare parts, etc. Supplies are included in the current asset because they are expected to be consumed in the normal operating cycle. Example, resibo. You need paper or you need rolls of paper to print receipts. So that can fall under supplies. There are certain spare parts that will fall under supply. Spare parts ng mga equipment or spare parts ng mga equipment and so on. Those are assets that will be presented in the current asset kasi they are expected to be consumed in the normal operating cycle. Finally is prepaid rent. Ang prepaid rent naman, this happens when the company paid rent in advance. Ang company, they paid rent in advance. So for 1 year or for 2 years, nagbayad ng advance ang isang company. Prepaid rent is also classified in the current asset. Why? Number 1, it's part of the normal operating cycle. Kasi sa negosyo, you really need to rent. Especially kung wala kang sarili mong property. There is a time that you may need to rent. Kailangan mong mag-rent. And this is really part of the operations kasi kung wala kang space or kung wala kang rental space, how can you operate? How can you operate kung wala ka namang location, di ba? So that's why prepaid rent is a part of current assets because of this rule or because of this criteria that it's expected to be realized in the entity's normal operating cycle. Another thing that I want to discuss, sir, what if ang accounts receivable, what if mababayaran siya ni customer 1 year or 2 years from now? Do we still present it in the current assets? The answer is yes. Accounts receivable will always be presented in current assets. Why? Because it's a part of trade. It's a part of the normal operating cycle. Kasama siya sa operations mo. So accounts receivable will always be presented in the current assets. Next. It is held primarily for the purpose of being traded. So what are examples of assets that we trade? Now, number 1 is inventories. For merchandising companies, what do merchandising companies do? They buy inventories and then they sell it. So that is for merchandising companies. And for manufacturing naman, ano yung ginagawa ng mga manufacturing companies? Manufacturing companies process a product. They process a product and then after finishing production, kung tapos na yung manufacturing ng product, that's the time they sell it to customers. So therefore, inventories is presented under current assets. Why? Because its purpose is for trade. You purchase inventory, you purchase raw materials for your manufactured products for the purpose of being traded. In other words, bakit mo ba binili? Why have you purchased inventory? Because at the end, ibebenta mo rin sa iba. So that is what we mean by purpose of being traded. And some investments will also be classified as current asset because of this criteria. It is held primarily for the purpose of being traded. May mga investors kasi na ang ginagawa nila, bumibili sila ng shares of stock ni Jollibee, shares of stock ni Globe, shares of stock ni Ayala Land. And what they do is, if the value of those investments or if the value of those shares of stock will increase, that's the time they will sell those shares of stock. O may mga investors kasi na ang ginagawa nila, they purchase shares of stock or they purchase investments. And then what they do is, pag mataas na yung value ng mga investments na yun, that's the time they sell it. Ibebenta nila kung mataas na yung value. So that's why some investments will also be classified as current assets just because the purpose of purchasing that investment is for trading purposes. So that's why it's part of the current assets. And then number 3, it is expected to be realized within 12 months after the reporting period. This criteria applies most especially to loans. Kung ikaw ang creditor, and yung mga loans o yung mga pinautang mo sa mga customers, they will be realized within 12 months after the reporting period. So I'll give you an example for this criteria. Okay. imaginein mo or try to imagine that you are a creditor. Ikaw yung creditor. Ikaw ang creditor. Assume the balance sheet date is December 31, 2021. Assume that the reporting date is December 31, 2021. So there are three scenarios that I want to discuss. Letter A. There is a 2 million loan due on July 31, 2022. What does it mean? On July 31, 2022, you are expected, or syempre yung debtor, ang may utang sa'yo, due date niya, July 31, 2022. It means that during that date, you are expected to collect 2 million pesos from the debtor. So yung 2 million pesos loan na to, mababayaran siya July 31, 2022. Kasi ito yung due date. Ito yung due date. July 31, 2022. How do we present letter A? Letter A is presented in current asset. Why? Because it will be realized within 12 months after the reporting period. So, try to count from December 31, 2021 to July 31, 2022. So, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. So, 7 months. So, it's within the 12 months after the reporting date. Therefore, letter A is presented in current asset. Kasi yung letter A, ine-expect mo na matatanggap mo na to July 31, 2022. How about letter B? 2 million pesos loan due on July 31, 2023. Letter B is presented in non-current asset. Why 2023 pa ang due date? It's beyond 12 months. Kasi ang reporting date, December 31, 2021. So it's beyond 1 year or 12 months after the reporting date. It's beyond 12 months. So letter B is presented as non-current asset. Okay. How about letter C? Kasi ang letter C, 2 million pesos loan payable in installment. So ang payment mo ng 2 million pesos loan or ang payment ni debtor rather is payable in installment. What does it mean? Ang 1 million pesos loan or yung 1 million pesos, yung 1 million pesos dito, ine-expect mo na matatanggap mo na on July or on December 31, 2022. So yung 1 million, matatanggap mo siya December 31, 2022. Meanwhile, the other part, yung 1 million pesos loan naman, it will be collected or makokollect mo siya 2023 pa. So 2023 mo pa matatanggap yung remaining 1 million peso loan. So how do we present this? Kasi installment ang payment. The first 1 million pesos will be paid on 2022. The other half is payable in 2023. So what is the implication? Okay. Number 1, yung due on December 31, 2022, it will be presented in current asset. Yung 1 million pesos na part, yung due on December 31, 2022, this will be presented as current asset. Why? This is expected to be collected or this is expected to be realized within 12 months after the reporting period. So, December 31, 2021 to December 31, 2022. So, it's within 1 year or it's within 12 months. Therefore, this will be presented as current asset. Meanwhile, the remaining 1 million peso loan that is due on December 31, 2023 is presented as non-current asset. The remaining 1 million peso loan, kasi 2023 mo pa siya makokolek. So, it's beyond 1 year. So, therefore, ito, non-current asset. This will be presented as a non-current asset. So that is for the third criteria. And then last, we will first delete all the drawings. Okay. It is cash or cash equivalent. So what is the presumption? If it is a cash or cash equivalent, it is a current asset. So meron tayong presumption na pag cash or cash equivalent siya, it's presented as a current asset. So what do we mean by cash equivalents? Ito na yung treasury bills, commercial paper, negotiable certificates of deposit, and redeemable preference shares. So those are examples of cash equivalents. The assumption is they are presented as current asset. Unless, may exception, unless it is restricted from being exchanged or used to settle a liability for at least 12 months after the end of the reporting period. The question is, why can it be restricted? Bakit kaya ang cash pwede siyang maging restricted? There are 3 possible reasons. Number 1, it has a specific purpose. Let's say na meron kang fund that you need to keep for the purpose of purchasing a property or for the purpose of purchasing an equipment. So kumbaga pa, nag-iipon ka ng pera to purchase a property or to purchase a non-current asset or to purchase an equipment. If this is the case, it is not cash. Hindi siya presented as current. It's presented as non-current. Bakit? Restricted Meron siyang specific purpose. Meron kang panggagamitan nito. So because of that, this is presented as a non-current asset. Kung meron siyang specific purpose. Especially if purchase of depreciable assets or purchase of property. Pag ganyan, non-current asset yan. Number 2, contractual agreements. May mga loan agreements kasi that states that you cannot use a certain fund or may account ka na hindi pwedeng gamitin because it's part of the loan agreement na isa sa mga conditions, etong bank account na to or etong fund na to, hindi mo pwedeng gamitin. So, may possibility kasi na nasa contract na hindi talaga siya pwedeng gamitin. So, because of that, pag restricted ang cash, because of a contractual agreement, it will be presented as a non-current asset. And then, last, it will be used to pay a long-term liability. So, may mga times kasi that a company allocates money for the purpose of payment of a long-term liability. An example of this is a bond sinking fund. So what is a bond sinking fund? The bond sinking fund is used to pay the bonds or to pay long-term liabilities. So if that's the case, if the cash will be used for the sole purpose of payment of a long-term liability, it will be presented as a non-current asset. Kasi it will be used to pay a long-term liability. So it's a non-current asset. And then finally, an entity shall classify other assets as non-current. So an entity shall classify all other assets as non-current. So what are examples of assets that will classify as a non-current asset? So ano yung mga examples dito? Ano yung mga examples? Number 1, property, plant, and equipment. So this is one of the main examples of assets that will be presented in the non-current asset. Why is it presented in the non-current asset? Kasi long-term long-term purpose, long-term consumption. Yung property, plant, and equipment, you will not be using or consuming it for 1 year. You will consume it for 5 years, for 10 years, for 50 years, and so on. So given that the consumption of equipment or the use of property, plant, and equipment are long-term, this will be presented as non-current asset. Ano pa yung ibang examples ng non-current assets? Pwede din dito yung intangible assets. So it will be presented under non-current assets. So intangible assets, example, copyright, trademark, patents, and other intangible assets. So those will be presented as non-current. Why? The consumption of intangible assets are beyond 1 year, or it's beyond the normal operating cycle of the company. So it's beyond that. So what does it mean? The consumption or the use of intangible assets are long-term. Kasi ito, yung mga rights such as patent, copyright, magagamit mo yan or you will be able to consume it for a long time. Depende kung ilang years ang binigay sa'yo or ilang years yung binigay na right sa'yo to use the intangible assets. So that's why intangible assets are generally presented as non-current. In reality, marami pang examples ng non-current assets. But I will not discuss everything because for some of you, you might be confused. So I just want to discuss lang kung ano yung mga main examples ng mga assets that are presented as non-current assets. So that's it for our discussion for today for current and non-current asset. I hope that you learned something for today, and thank you so much for listening.